Hello and welcome to today's webinar on certificate-based authentication for Exchange Online Remote PowerShell. Vasile will be our speaker today. Just going to go through a couple housekeeping notes. I know that we had requested questions prior to the event, and I know Vasile has a lot to cover, so we'll try to get to as many of those questions at the end as possible. Any questions that we don't get to, we'll cover in a follow-up blog post. But if you do have questions throughout the event, just enter them in the question panel of GoToWebinar. And we'll just give it a couple more minutes here until Vasile starts. But we're excited for today's event. We know it's been kind of a long time coming, so we hope you enjoy as well.
Thank you, Laura. So let's give it one more minute. I see that people are still joining and we will get started.
Another quick note, we are recording the session, so you'll receive the recording in the next couple days.
Okay, so it's past 03 on my clock here, so let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Vasil Michev, and I will be your host today on the Certificate-Based Authentication for Exchange Online Remote PowerShell webinar. So let's give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So first of all, what is certificate-based authentication and how you can get to start using it. Then we'll cover how it relates to the V2 Exchange Online module, which we covered in details in our previous few webinars, and the REST Cmdlets as well. We'll do a quick demo before we go into a more deep dive, covering all the different setup steps you need to perform in order to get started with this. Then we will do yet another more detailed demo of how you can actually visualize basically those steps in a real environment there. We'll switch then to covering some additional scenarios, give you an example of what we as a company are using the certificate-based authentication for. And then at the end, we have a lot of questions that you guys submitted over the past few days. And hopefully we will also have some additional time to cover questions that we've received here on the webinar. And yeah, lastly, we'll provide you with some resources. As Laura mentioned, you will also receive the recording afterwards. And if there are any questions that we didn't manage to cover over the time that we have allocated here, we'll cover them in a separate blog post later on. So let's get started. What exactly is certificate-based authentication for Exchange Online Remote PowerShell? Well, as the name suggests, it's basically a new way to authenticate and get to use those cmdlets. So in a manner of speaking, it's not that big of a feature. Yeah, it's just change of a way that you authenticate to Exchange Online. But then if you come to think that Microsoft has been on this journey to disable basic authentication throughout the different Office 365 and related services, and in particular in Exchange Online, this had been an ongoing journey for a while now. Just yesterday, they published yet another update on the different steps they're taking across the different protocols and so on. You can go ahead and check it on the EO blog. But anyway, so it's another method of authenticating, which is basically much better compared to basic authentication. So basic authentication is the username and password we are used to, and we've been using for the past 20, 30 years or so. It's no longer considered secure. So wherever possible, it's advised to to more modern methods, and one of those modern methods is using certificate-based authentication. But the name here is actually a bit misleading. It's not just about being able to authenticate via certificate. It's being able to run things in the context of a service principal or application object and leverage the so-called application, the client credential flow for authenticating against the newer graph APIs that Microsoft is using for Office 365. So while we'll mostly talk about certificates here, you can also use methods like client secrets and so on, but we'll cover those in details. So to get this new feature, you need to install the latest preview version of the V2 PowerShell module. So in the next few slides, we'll just do a very quick refresher on what's the module, what's included there, and so on. If you need some additional details on all this, just go ahead and watch our previous webinars. We covered those in, I think, 3 webinars already, so there's a lot of information there. So in a nutshell, it's a new module. It's where Microsoft is putting their effort going forward. So this is the module you should be using in the future. It's distributed as part of the PowerShell gallery now, so it's no longer a run once installer like you were used to previously with the MFA enabled module. So it includes both the REST-based and the old style commandlets. So the REST-based are new commandlets built on a new infrastructure, which is more robust, more performant, and will give you a lot of benefits, but it only covers a handful of operations currently. So for everything else, you can continue using the old commandlets, the old style commandlets you are familiar with remote from using Exchange Online Remote PowerShell. They are backwards compatible. You can continue using them in the same manner. So this module only supports modern authentication. So if you are using basic authentication, you will not be able to connect. And it's constantly updated, so the team has sort of committed to updating it once per month or so. So over the past few months, they've introduced features like being able to use delegated access for partners now, being able to connect to the security and compliance center commandlets, being able to connect to other Office 365 environments, the China Cloud, for example, and so on, the GCC and so on. And the latest feature they've introduced is support for certificate-based authentication. So I will skip the next slide, which is basically, again, a refresher of what the REST commandlets are, what sort of improvements they give you, and just go straight to the essence of this presentation, basically. So in order to start using the certificate-based authentication feature in Exchange Online, you need to download and install the 2.0.3 preview version of the module. You can simply do a find module, install module, and get it over with. You need to use the allow pre-release switch because it's still a preview version. Once it matures to GA status, it will be incorporated in the main module. And the commandlet that you can use is still the same. There's just a bunch of new parameters that the Microsoft folks have introduced there in order to facilitate connectivity with certificates. So one example usage of the commandlets introducing those new parameters is the following. So you have the let me get this wazzer pointer here. So you have the certificate thumbprint, which will point to a certificate stored in the My store for the user, which is currently running PowerShell. You have the application ID, which will correspond to an application that you have registered in Azure AD and configured in order to be able to facilitate this authentication process. And the last parameter that you have to specify is the dash organization one, specifying basically your tenant, the tenant to which you are trying to connect. We'll get into more details on all this now, but first let me introduce some other parameters there that you might have to use eventually. Sorry. So if instead of pointing to a certificate thumbprint, you want to point to a file stored on the local file system, you can use the certificate file path. If this is a password protected file like a PFX container where the certificate is located inside it, you might also need to provide a password, which is done via the dash certificate password parameter. The certificate template we already covered, just point to a certificate stored in the local user store, and the rest are the application ID and the organization here. So the next is basically intended to be a very, very quick demo on how exactly you can, oh, I have to switch screens here, just give me a second. Okay, let's see, you should hopefully be able to see PowerShell. I see now, come on. Okay, I paused the recording here. So I know it's a bit small, but hopefully you guys can see it. So this short demo basically is the first commandlet here. What we saw previously on the slide, it's connect Exchange Online, and I'm pointing to a certificate, and I'm giving the application ID and the organization. I can also use the show banner parameter just to avoid some additional information being presented. But as soon as I do this, I'll be connected to Exchange Online. You will see the same process starting to download the commandlets in the temp file and loading them in the session and so on. And now I can basically go ahead and start using them. So this is basically the list of mailbox in my tenant, and I did the authentication process here completely automatically. I was not prompted to, I was not presented with any dialog to enter credentials or anything like this. So this is in a nutshell the essence of the feature. You will be able to now perform automatic tasks leveraging this certificate-based or client secret authentication. The commandlets are all the same. You have pretty much the same experience with them, and we'll cover this in a bit more details later on. So just for to end this quick demo, I want to show some other quick examples of how you can leverage the other parameters. So if you are pointing to a file, you simply enter the path to the file, the rest is the same. Or if you are pointing to a password protected PFX, you can use the following syntax. So you store, I'm basically storing the path in a variable, providing the variable. The important thing here is that you need to provide the password as a secure string. And that's basically the gist of it. So switching back to our slides now, and actually I have to switch screens, I suppose. That was basically the quick demo of how you can connect to Exchange Online via certificate-based authentication. Now we'll switch to a more deep dive and introduce basically all the concepts here that are being leveraged in order to enable this feature. So the first thing that you need to understand is how this authentication actually happens on the back end. Those of you that have dealt with the Graph APIs, or let's say the new Azure AD PowerShell modules, know that it basically what happens is basically you contact Azure AD to facilitate this authentication, and in order to be able to obtain an access token, which is what you actually present in front of the server to authenticate your user, you need to have some additional work done previously. Basically, this means registering an Azure AD application, an application which is integrated with your Azure AD tenant. To do this, there are very basic steps. I've just listed them here, but I will do a quick demo again just to go over them. So you basically open the Azure AD blade, go to the app registrations blade there, tap on the left, click new registration. You enter a name for the application and just accept the default settings there. Once you have done this, all you need to do next is to actually grant permissions to the applications. Without those permissions, you will not be able to access resources. So you need, in this case, to specify that you want to access Exchange, and more specifically, you are requesting the Exchange Manage as Application permissions, which is a new permission scope introduced specifically for the purpose of being able to authenticate against Exchange Online PowerShell. So once this is done, once you have the permissions, and once you have at least one resource against which you can use those permissions, you can start requesting tokens for the application, and then leveraging it in your code or PowerShell or whatever. If you want to do this for all the users in the company, and basically when you are adding permissions which require some additional which are considered highly secure, you have to also perform the so-called grant operation there. And you can then basically that completes the initial setting of the application, and then you can start using it, as I mentioned. But to do so, again, it requires you some knowledge of the specific, basically specifics there. So previously, what we had with basic authentication is you provide username and password, server authenticates it, and you get access to the application, and you can do whatever there. Now, with the when you are authenticating against Azure AD, you are using the token model. Basically, it's the new modern OAuth-based APIs. So you are once you present your credentials, which can be either username and password, or they can be something like a certificate, or nowadays we have things like FIDO keys, phone authentications, and whatnot. We have a variety of authentications methods which we can use, and we can use any of those methods to authenticate. And then once the credentials are verified, we are receiving a few tokens, mainly here the access token, which is the important one, and which we will then be able to present to a given application in order for us to be able to actually perform different operations via this application. Let's say against Exchange Online or SharePoint Online and so on. In a nutshell, that's how the model works. Of course, there are many more details there. I've included some links into the in the resources slide later on, so you can read up on them if you need to. So as I mentioned, you need to actually configure some sort of authentication for the application. This can be in this particular model that we are using, the application permission model. This can be either a certificate or a client secret. Certificate is what we will do now, and client secret is basically a very long string that you can use instead of a password. It's considered less secure in general. So this is one of the reasons why Microsoft decided basically to support only certificate-based authentication, at least in this initial release of the feature. And again, in general, it's considered more secure when you are using certificate, because you can protect the private key with some additional features there, like password, or you can just bind it to a specific machine, and only people that have access to this machine can then leverage this authentication, and so on. So in order to actually configure this, while you are still on the blade, you have to perform a few more clicks. We'll go over them in a second in a live demo. Just a few more notes here. I know we had some questions around this. So first of all, about these certificate new generation APIs, you cannot currently leverage those. I mean, technically, you can actually go ahead and configure such for the application in the Azure AD Blade, but the functions that the PowerShell module in particular is using to create the certificate object currently does not support those. So you should use the other methods there. The example at the end is how you can create actually a self-signed certificate to use with this application. There was also a question: should you use self-signed certificate? Should you be using a PKI one, or even a third-party certificate authority one? It's all up to you in a nutshell. If you want to, for example, have a certificate which never expires, your only option basically is for you to do the self-signed route or your own PKI, because nowadays nobody will actually issue such certificate for you. You can also configure multiple certificates. For example, if you have a certificate which expires in the next few days, and for whatever reason you don't want to go over the hassle of renewing it and changing it and so on, you can actually add an additional one, and so on. Again, we'll cover this in more detail just in a second in the demo. And just to finish up on what needs to be done before you can actually start using this newly created application to actually access Exchange Online Commandlets. At this point, so far, what we've configured was to create the application, configure the permissions that the application, that the user running the application will get against, in this case, Exchange Online, and also configure the authentication method that the user can actually use to authenticate. But at this point, so basically, you can actually run the application, connect, and present those credentials to Exchange Online. Exchange Online, however, at this point will not allow you to run PowerShell commands because you simply don't have the necessary permissions. See, the thing here is that you are now running things in the context of an application object or a service principal object corresponding to the application as represented in your directory. You are no longer running the PowerShell commandlets in a user context. Never in this process you are providing actually a username and password. So when you connect to Exchange Online, it doesn't know who you are. It doesn't know what permissions you have, and it doesn't know which commandlets you actually have access to. So you need a way basically to designate that this service principal object, which corresponds to the application there, can run this, and this commandlet and so on. So currently this is done by specifying, by assigning an Azure AD role to the service principal object. You can do this also from the Azure AD blade. And the next one of the next slides lists actually all the roles that are currently supported. And the idea is that in the future, you will also be able to assign Exchange-specific roles or role groups to this object. But currently, at least for the initial release of the feature, you are actually limited to just a handful of Azure AD roles. Well, it's 7 or 8 of them, so enough for you to be able to automate almost any task there. And those include things like the global admin or Exchange admin and so on. Or if you want like a read-only role, you can go with the global reader or something which is like security reader, limited access to a subset of commandlets basically. But again, because it's only limited to Azure AD roles, currently you lack the granularity of the Exchange RBAC control. So you cannot say that this particular user this particular application can run only, let's say, the get mailbox commandlets, get recipient commandlets, and I don't know, manage distribution groups and nothing else in the organization. You lack this granularity, which you can configure with RBAC roles, but hopefully in the future those will be supported. So yeah, the last note here is that you cannot actually use the M365 Admin Center to add those permissions. Currently, you have to actually use the Azure AD Blade. And now, after all this talk, let's go ahead and actually see how we can do this. If I can get out of full screen mode. So browser, let's see. Okay, so here I've logged into the Azure AD Blade in one of my developer accounts here. Okay, let's start from the beginning. This is the Azure AD portal. I go and open the Azure Active Directory app here, Blade. And then on the left, go to the app registration page. Here under all applications, you can see that it's a blank directory, nothing is here, nothing is created here. So let's go ahead and create a new application that we will then leverage to actually connect to Exchange Online PowerShell. So we can name it whatever you want. This name is not used anywhere. So let's see, my ExO app. So there are a few additional settings that might be relevant depending on which scenario you're trying to address, but for the most generic scenarios here, you can just go ahead and press the register button. The name is all you need to provide at this point. Then the application is created. The corresponding application ID is generated, and this is basically what I use there in the Connect Exchange Online commandlet. So at some point, I will need to actually copy it and start pasting it into my commandlets and so on. Now, at this point, we've created the application. We haven't actually configured any permissions, so we haven't designated what kind of operations it can perform, and we haven't actually configured the authentication. So let's start with the permissions. I don't know, because this is how I ordered them in the presentation. So you go to the API permissions tab on the left, you click the add permissions button. So we are running here okay, I went too far ahead. So we need to add permissions for Exchange. So in order to do this, we need to select Exchange from this list of currently supported APIs. It's listed down at the bottom under legacy supported APIs. So you click Exchange here, and you need to select application permissions on this screen, because we are running now in the so-called application permissions model, where again you don't have a corresponding user object, so username and password and so on. You are actually running in the context of an application which has a corresponding service principal object in the directory. So these permissions will be granted on the corresponding service principal object. So you select application permissions here, you go and expand the Exchange checkbox here and select Exchange Manage as App. Press Add Permissions, and as I said, you need to actually consent, because this is a highly forgot the word, sorry, it's highly secure asset, let's say. So an administrator in the company actually has to sort of approve this before you can start doing so. So you grant the consent, and basically that's it permission wise. Now at this point, we have permissions for this application. So if I'm able to actually authenticate, I'll be able to connect to a corresponding application, which is in this case Exchange, but we haven't yet configured actual authentication methods. So in order to do so, on the left, I go to authentication. I'll go to certificates and secrets. And here I can configure one of those two methods. As I mentioned, you can actually use both, but what's currently supported is the use of certificates. So click the button and okay, I need to minimize some stuff. And you can then at some point select something. Where are my certificates? Let's say this one. You point to a certificate object, certificate file.crt.cer or something. You upload it, and that's pretty much it. You have the thumbprint of the certificate, expiration date, and that's all there is to it. As I mentioned, you can actually upload multiple certificates, use any of those to actually connect, and so on. Anyway, this concludes the initial setup of the application. So at this point, we have application created, we have permissions for this application, and we have a method to actually authenticate in order to use this application. So we are all set to actually obtain a token and present it against Azure AD, which in turn will then allow us to access different resources which it protects, such as Exchange Online, PowerShell, and so on. However, as I mentioned, in this case, this is actually not sufficient, because Exchange Online is yet to actually embrace those new graph APIs. What Microsoft is currently doing is more of a workaround. It's employing some of those functionalities to actually facilitate the authentication process, but on the back end, they've made some changes there in order to be able to recognize that this object that we will now be using to authenticate can actually is actually allowed to run Exchange Cmdlets and so on. As I mentioned, you don't have the granularity of the RBAC model to designate what exactly it can run currently, but apologies, but you can use the rows and rows within Azure AD to actually designate what can happen. So I can select, for example, let's say the Exchange Administrator here, a row. So I go back to the directory blade under rows and administrator. I select the row that I want to use out of the list that we had previously on the slide, for example, the Exchange Administrator. And what I need to do here is either paste the long identifier that I copied earlier, or I can actually just type in the name of the application and it will appear. I select, add it, and that's pretty much it. So at this point, I'm not only able to actually access, obtain an access token for this application, but the token will contain all the necessary information that Exchange Online will then use and validate in order to actually grant me permissions to grant me access to a set of cmdlets that I will be able to run. So that's sort of the deep dive guide demo / thingy on all the steps that you need to perform. If you haven't actually been doing this previously for different applications that integrate with Azure AD, it might be a bit convoluted or complicated for you. There are very detailed steps which we've included in our blogs. The official documentation as well explains all these concepts in more details. You will find resources there in the last on the last slide of the presentation. And let's see what's next. Probably need to switch again the screen. Apologies. So this basically shows you how you can configure everything from scratch, and it might sound complicated, but if you simply follow the instructions, it's like 10 clicks in total. You just point and click to where the documentation is showing you, and you can configure this. Of course, you need to have the certificate ready beforehand. As I mentioned, you can actually use a self-signed certificate or a certificate from your internal CA or even a public one, but that's pretty much it. Everything else can be configured via a few clicks in the portal, and you don't have to prepare anything other than the certificate. So if this process seems a bit convoluted to you, one of the Microsoft PFE guys has actually prepared a PowerShell module that automates pretty much, well, not everything, but almost everything of this creation process. I've included a link here. You can get and download his module from the PowerShell gallery, and also contribute and read the documentation over at GitHub. As I mentioned earlier, currently only certificates which are present in the personal store of the user are supported. So you cannot use the local machine store, but Microsoft is working on adding support for this in the future. You can also use client secret. We will get to this once we go to the more detailed demo. What else? What's important here? Let's see. Okay, so yeah. A few notes that I want to make. Again, because we are running things now in the context of an application which is sort of new compared to what we have previously with Exchange, you might be worried of whether these operations that you will be performing are actually being audited in some way. They are indeed audited. You can find them in the corresponding admin audit log, and you will find the record with the tenant name / application ID. I think I have a screenshot later on. We will see it. If not, I will just refer you to the blog post where I did include a screenshot earlier. So auditing is covered. This is an important thing. What's not covered is the actual authentication process, because Azure AD currently doesn't actually collect or expose, let's say, audit records which are related to this application. The client credentials flow. In turn, this means that while you can run operations with an automated script, for example, or an application which leverages certificate-based authentication, and you can actually use the Exchange Online or the unified audit walk in Office 365 to see what changes have been made, you cannot actually see how often this application has connected, if it's only using, for example, just get cmdlets to gather all the data inside your Exchange organization and so on. You cannot actually see it currently. This is basically a limitation of Azure AD. As far as I know, the corresponding product group is actually working on providing some additional controls there, exposing all those logs, and more importantly, providing some sort of solution for us to be able to limit access, because currently if you have access to the certificate you have configured for this application, or which is the worst case scenario, if somebody has actually gotten access to the client secret that you've configured. As I mentioned earlier, a client secret is basically a very long password. So everybody that has this very long string can connect to your application and use it from anywhere. You cannot limit access via conditional access policies, via MFA, or anything like this. Basically, effectively, this process sort of bypasses the conditional access pipeline and the MFA pipeline. From one hand, this is a very good thing because it allows us to actually automate all this. On the other hand, if you want actually to be more secure and so on, it's not that good. And again, it's a known issue. It's not something specific to Exchange Online certificate-based authentication. It's specific to the entire scenario of leveraging client credentials against the Azure AD, the Graph APIs. Again, Microsoft is working on additional controls there, so this should improve in the future, and hopefully now that it's actually relevant to high-profile applications such as Exchange, it will happen even faster. It also, again, it correlates to the effort that Microsoft is currently running in order to eradicate basic authentication from your organization. But if you have seen our previous webinars, and I'll actually remind you about this in a slide or two. The Exchange Online Remote PowerShell actually still happens over the basic WinRM, basic authentication WinRM endpoint. Even though you are not using username and password, you are actually presenting the token that was obtained in an earlier stage. It still happens over the basic authentication, though this might be creating some problems for you. And in the long run, again, this is something that Microsoft will have to address once basic authentication is deprecated across the board. And the last note that I want to mention here is that currently the initial release of the preview version of the module doesn't actually include support for the Security and Compliance Center commandlets. But you can get access to the REST commandlets, for example, and you will actually discuss some workarounds later on. So let's see. I should have a demo prepared at this stage, I think, and then we will talk about the additional scenarios. Let me just switch the screen again. And let's cover some scenarios. So currently what we did is basically confirm that we can actually use this method to connect seamlessly to Exchange Online and run some commandlets. Now we go just to illustrate what I talked a minute ago about using the basic authentication WinRM endpoint. If we simply take a look at the properties of the session that was just created, we can see that it's again leveraging the very known endpoints here. It's using basically some additional parameters. So for example, you will have here the, oh, it's cut off. Anyway, the idea is that it will actually show you the authentication, which is basic, and you will actually see this additional parameter here, which is part of the workaround which I mentioned, how Microsoft is actually enabling Exchange to be able to run things in the context of a service principal object instead of what we are currently used to, the user object. And just again to confirm that it's not leveraging any sort of basic authentication, if you take a look at the credentials object, you can see first of all how the username looks in this way. In this case, it's basically something made up. It's the string to out user at my tenant identifier. I don't have any user which with this username actually, which is probably an interesting thing to test. I should have thought about this earlier. Anyway, if you actually take a look at the password, it's a very long string, which is basically this access token. So if I go ahead and copy this thing, and we can then, I don't know, go and paste it here in some website, which can decrypt it for us, and we can see all the interesting details. So, for example, where I'm allowed, against which application I'm allowed to actually use this token. This is the name of the application. So it's not the application we created previously because this was in a different tenant. I should have maybe used that, but anyway, this is the permissions that we've granted the Exchange Manages app, and this under WIDs lists all the roles that the service principal object, which is corresponding to the application, has been granted in my directory. In this case, I think that's this includes the Exchange admin, the global admin, and global reader or something like that. And so it has all the necessary permissions basically to run all the commandlets inside my tenant. That sort of, again, fills in on the different details on how the authentication process works, but that's basically what's changing for us as the end users. We are simply able to leverage modern authentication in a slightly different fashion. If you remember how we talked about using modern authentication for Exchange Online PowerShell in our previous webinars, you've probably seen basically the same behavior. I've shown there that you are still using this basic authentication WinRM remote Exchange PowerShell session. So the URL is slightly different and you are passing a token instead of a password. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much the same process. I can, because it's pretty much the same process, I actually know how to leverage this process, let's say, sort of manually in my scripts. And this is what I want to show you next here for the additional scenarios section, basically how you can effectively leverage this outside of the PowerShell, the V2 PowerShell module, because in some environment you might not be able to run it. Currently, the module is only supported on the Windows PowerShell version, so you cannot run it on PowerShell Core. And for example, different environments which only run PowerShell Core will not be able to use this module. So how do you actually leverage this in a manual fashion? Well, basically all you need to do is obtain a token. Because it's still a remote Exchange PowerShell session, you pass the token, as part of the credential object, and you are able to connect via the same method that we've been using for years. So let me just clean up here a bit, and what we'll do next is basically obtain a token. I'm doing this via the ADAO methods, so there are other different ways that you can do this, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I was simply leveraging this. So here I'm basically pointing to the same certificate which I used previously and creating a client assurance credential. What did I do? Certificate. Maybe you should actually test your demos first. Okay, let's try the other one. This is actually pointing to PFX. Oh, well, PFX I cannot run without the actual password. Nobody copy my password, please. Okay, that's better. So at this point, I should have actually obtained a token, and let's see. Oops, no token. Huh. Interesting. There goes my demo. Let's see what else. Sorry, just what? Oh, yeah, maybe I should actually code this thing first. Damn. Okay. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't actually change the application identifier before I'm running the demos. Okie doke. This and the context here. Okay, if I fail this time, I'll just skip to it. Skip it. Nah. Anyway, so the idea here was to actually show you how you can how you can obtain a token programmatically and then pass it to the application. But because we actually already did obtain a token, even though I'm actually copying it from PowerShell, it's sort of cheating. But anyway, the demo failed for some reason, so I will not waste time troubleshooting it here. So I will simply set come on. I will simply set this manually, and then I will set this as the credential variable. And then what I will do is basically create a new remote PowerShell session in the same fashion that we've basically been doing for years. So I'm basically running new PS session cmdlet via the same parameters, same configuration name, same URL. The only thing I've added here is basically a little hint to help the server route this to the correct endpoint there. Oh man, I can swear this demo worked previously. Not sure what I did here. Access denied. Am I using the right thing? Sorry, just want to confirm if this is my actual tenant or am I using something else. No, it's my actual tenant, and I have everything. Interesting. Right. Third time is the charm. Oh, right, finally. So this whole exercise should illustrate basically that you can obtain these tokens outside of the PowerShell module via any of the methods that you might be familiar with, using the Graph API, using the ADAO binaries, whatever. And once you have a valid token, you can simply pass it in a credential variable here and be connected. And because you can obtain this token via various methods, for example, by using client secret and so on, you can actually avoid having to use certificate-based authentication and still get access to the commandlets in an automatic fashion here. So the same thing you can do basically to run the REST commandlets eventually if I fix my demos. And what else? This example here is used to illustrate that you can pretty much do the same via the client secret. So run the same method to obtain a token via client secret, which of course I've sanitized, so I cannot run this now. And the last example that I wanted to show, which hopefully would run here, is basically how you can leverage this same method to in a multi-tenant scenario. So basically what I'm doing here is, instead of using my tenant, I'm providing the identifier for a different Azure AD organization. And if everything goes well this time, which might happen, I will be actually able to leverage an application that I've created in my tenant to access a different tenant and manage it via the Exchange Online PowerShell command. It's sort of the delegation scenario for a partner or CSP or a vendor which has to deal with multiple customers and doesn't necessarily want to create this application in every tenant. What they can do is create this application as a multi-tenant application, then have the tenants simply consent to it, and everything basically is pre-configured for us to use, apart from the actual permissions that need to be added in Azure AD as part of the initial setup that we did. So yeah, apologies, this demo was a mess, and hopefully these slides will now reiterate what I was trying to show there. So I'll skip this one, not that interesting, basically showing you that it's still using the basic authentication endpoint. Now, what we did for the manual connectivity, because we already done all the steps, we have an application registered, we have the authentication method configured, and we have the permissions assigned, I can actually obtain a token programmatically. That was the whole idea of the demo. I can validate the token as we did in the gwt.ms to make sure that all the necessary permissions are configured and that the application is actually configured to access Exchange Online and so on. And then I can simply pass it as a variable. And this was the example that should have worked the first time, but something happened. So basically, you can use the good old new PS session method to actually connect via this, this automated way. And more information is in the blog post if you need it. Now, basically upgrading the previous scenarios, doing the same, but for multi-tenant scenarios. Only thing you need to do is actually change the application to be a multi-tenant. You don't actually have to register on your application. You can simply change the settings there, but that's not important. Then you have to get the other tenant, the external tenants, to consent to the application, which you can do by basically providing them with a long URL like this one. And once this has happened and they have consented to the application and added the necessary permissions in their Azure AD directory, you can do this manually. You can do this manual connectivity process in order to get access to their tenant and the set of commandlets that they have granted for this application in their tenant. It doesn't necessarily translate to what you had in your tenant. So for example, in my tenant, I have the full access, so the global access permission, the global admin access level, while in the other tenant, I might be limited to something far more restricted compared to this. Again, more details in the blog article there. And moving on, because I'm seeing that we are running out of time, just sort of a real life example of what we as a company are doing. Quadrotech actually has several products that leverages Exchange Online PowerShell in one way or the other. So what we are currently been doing, because of customers constantly asking us to make sure that we are leveraging modern authentication wherever possible, including Exchange Online. Previously, this was only possible if we agreed with them to configure some sort of a bypass for their conditional access policies, or add our IPs as trusted IPs or something like this. Now we can actually do this, leverage this certificate-based authentication in our products, and we have actually already implemented this in several of them. We can use either the one application for all tenants model, or we can use each tenant creates their own application, so they actually are in control of what this application can do, how we can authenticate to it, and at any point that they can actually revoke access to us, and so on. Okay, so very quickly trying to address as many questions as possible. Apologies, I messed up the demos and ran out of time. So this is sort of a summary of the questions that we have gotten over the past few days. So first question, can we use this in Azure Runbooks or Azure Automation, on in general any other environment outside of the PowerShell module? So this is one of what the previous demo was supposed to illustrate, that you can actually do this whole thing programmatically without having to rely on the module. But as long as the module can actually be loaded in an environment such as Azure Runbooks, you can actually do this. And a person basically have already prepared a guide, which I've included a link to you there in case you're interested in this scenario. Just go to this GitHub page and get all the details. Basically, you need to install the module and use it. That's pretty much it. So can you use third-party certificate authority or PKI certificates and not self-signed? Yes, I already answered this. You can use whatever type of certificate you want. Can you use CNG certificate? No, you cannot actually, because the module currently doesn't support those methods. But if you have registered this certificate in your AD application and you are calling this and you are obtaining the token programmatically outside of the module, you can actually use this. The next question is, when do you need to use the dash certificate password parameter? It's for scenarios where the certificate is stored in a container, such as a PFX file, which can be password protected. So then you have to actually provide the parameter as a secure, the password as a secure string, not as an actual literal string, because it will not work. What do you do when the certificate expires? You simply go ahead and switch it, or you add a new one, or add even a different authentication method such as the client secret. It's up to you. Can you use client secret? Yes, you can. Again, you can do this programmatically. The module currently only supports the certificate-based authentication. It's a deliberate decision on that Microsoft has made. Whether they will actually support this in the future, it's up to them to decide. Again, it's considered a less secure option, so maybe stick to using certificate-based authentication for the time being. Here's an interesting question. How can I adapt old scripts? So basically what is changing here is the method that you are using to authenticate. As long as you can actually authenticate, all the commandlets are pretty much the same. Well, pretty much, yeah, because as I mentioned several times, you are running things in the context of a service principal object now, not as a user. So some differences there will be visible. For example, commandlets which sort of inherit the username, such as get inbox rule, for example, will not work. You will actually have to provide the identity of the mailbox in order to get the list. But because again you are running this in an automated fashion and not for your user, it doesn't even make sense to run such applications without specifying the identity, such commandlets without specifying the identity against you want to run them. It's just a shortcut which is used in scenarios when you as the end user are basically running them. So anyway, the vast majority of the commandlets will behave the same. Earlier on, there were some issues with them, which Microsoft addressed over the course of the private preview that they did for this. pretty much all commandlets which I've tried nowadays are working as expected. Of course, this doesn't guarantee that everything will actually work as expected, because after all, this is still a preview version. So keep that in mind before you actually start using that for them in production. But as long as you actually do see that it's getting to the output you desire, you can feel free to go ahead and implement it in your code, because the method sort of is proven. As I mentioned, different other APIs that you might be using already are already using the same methods, so it's not that new, or you shouldn't expect much differences there. So as long as you can actually authenticate, you should expect your scripts to behave as they did. So simply change the authentication part of them, and again, just make sure that you actually test them before running in a production environment. So we have a bunch of questions which are related to V2, the V2 commandlets, the REST commandlets, and some certificate-based questions in general as authentication. Because as I imagined we will be running out of time at this point, I will leave those for the blog article. So I will leave the resources pane here, and I will try to quickly go over some of the questions that we might have received here and address them in the few minutes that we are left. So let's see, audio issues. Do I need public issue certificate? No, you don't need public issue certificate. The demo that I did earlier, the initial commandlet that I ran was with a self-signed certificate. It should run just fine. You can use, however, a public one if you want. It is not restricted in any way. Any updates of how to use CBA? Okay, so currently this is not supported. As I mentioned, the initial version of the module only supports the certificate-related parameters for the let's say main Exchange module. So only the connect-exchange online commandlets currently supports these parameters. At some point, I imagine that Microsoft will update the connect-IPPS session commandlet, which is what we use currently to connect to the Security and Compliance Center PowerShell, to also support them. And you should be able to leverage this at this point for the SCC commandlets or operations. Switched off screen, something with the demo. Can you use certificate from an internal CA? Yes. As I mentioned several times already, doesn't really matter where the certificate is from, as long as the Azure AD Blade accepts it. So if there are multiple administrators, should there be an app registration for each, or should they be only one certificate? What's the recommendation? So as I mentioned, the commandlets that you will be running here don't actually run in the context of an administrator. So as long as, then the question is how you are controlling access to the application or the script that you are using then to run Exchange Online PowerShell commandlets in the context of certificate-based authentication. So you can, I don't know, put a password, some sort of authentication on the application, but when it comes to the application, it all happens, it's all audited in the context of the service principal object corresponding to the application. So if you go ahead and check the Exchange audit log for operations performed via this module, you will always see the same entry. So if you want to be able to differentiate, yeah, it might be actually a good idea to add different applications that different groups within your organizations will be able to use, and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the drawbacks currently of this approach is that the actual login process is currently not audited, so you don't actually know who is connecting via those applications or script unless they perform some of the actions which are being audited by Exchange Online. The next question is something similar to this coming for Azure management? Well, practically all the Graph APIs support this. So you can basically use them programmatically in PowerShell. You can call the PowerShell commandlets from the Azure AD module by, again, obtaining a token externally, passing it to the Connect Azure AD commandlet, connecting, and then executing the commandlets, or again, just write your own solution, obtain the token, even call the endpoints directly via PowerShell. There are plenty of examples here available on the internet. I will try to include some more information about this scenario in the blog. It's a bit of outside of the scope here. So are there plans to integrate the certificate login functionality with PIM? Okay, so again, this is out of scope. I will address this in the blog article. Can we use the same procedure to connect to MSO service? No, I don't think so. You can use the same procedure to connect to the Azure AD PowerShell, but the old MSO service module, it's a bit more complicated. There you can actually use a token with it, but in order to obtain the token, you actually need to register the application against the old Azure AD API, not the Graph API, and I'm not sure that they support the Exchange Manager's app scope there. So pretty sure the answer, well, I'm not pretty sure, but I'm suspecting that the answer will be no on that front. And the last question, because I see that we are at the top of the hour. So with the username and password, the shell connection times out after a while, and you have to re-authenticate. When you connect via certificate, does it still time out after a period of time? Yes, pretty much the experience is the same of what you can expect from the V2 module. But that being said, the V2 module actually has a bunch of improvements in the, let's say, client logic, which is used to re-establish sessions, check the session validity, and so on. So in general, if you are using this method via the V2 module, the preview version, you'll get a better experience compared to what you might be used to. But don't assume that it will always reconnect and you will be able to run a commandlet indefinitely. This is still a very well known drawback of running long running commandlets against Exchange Online Remote PowerShell. It can disconnect from time to time. Something had happened. Even though there have been a bunch of improvements that Microsoft has made with the V2 module, you should still incorporate some sort of error checking in your scripts to make sure that you don't get unexpectedly disconnected at some point and everything goes to hell. When it comes to the actual, when it comes to change introduced because of this new feature, which only relates to authentication, the answer is no, it's pretty much the same. But as a whole, the V2 module actually gives you a lot better experience. Okay, so we have like 6 more questions, which we'll unfortunately have to wait for the blog article to be addressed. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending the webinar. Apologies for the demos. I can swear that they did work fine before the webinar. I'm not sure what I messed up there, but hopefully the point at least was illustrated, and we will try to then include just to reiterate over those points that I was trying to make in the upcoming blog article, which we will send to you post the webinar. And again, if you have some additional questions, don't hesitate to send them our way. They will have to wait for the blog article to be addressed, but we'll try to get to each of them. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.